Hello, it's about 6:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, just prior to the Yankee game. So this will be a brief video, but a pretty important one, I think, because we're coming around the turn on some important issues. It will be a brief video because I really want to present a make a presentation about Chapter 5. I'm not sure that I will be able to address all the issues I think Chapter 5 raises in one video too, for that matter. So I'll break it up in chunks, and as the rest of the week unfolds for me, I may decide to do this, that, and the other thing. I did a video, I believe, about Scott Rocks and the midterm expectation a day or two ago. So you have that, so you know where we're going with that, and what the expectation is with that. This chapter, quite frankly, I think crowns off the need. This chapter crowns off the content, the skills, the expectations for that midterm that much more specifically than we've got to at this point. As I said 1,000 times, you have a great textbook. I admire the author's work very much, and feel that what I'm doing is catalyzing what that's about to make it more real as we move through it. So, however, in this chapter, and this is where I'm bragging, I suppose, I have considerable expertise in program design, as I hope you have surmised already. And this chapter really speaks to me. So I'm going to, with that, I'm going to present this chapter, and you can probably expect that I'll be coming back to you with something else over the next few days. I'm not promising that or guaranteeing it, but certainly need to address this issue. So I'm taking the time to do it now. I have a few minutes before the Yankee game. He smiled, and let's get started. So I'm going to share the screen. There's a lot to be said as far as this is concerned. In fact, I am calling it part one, as an overview, so to speak. And notice, and you're going to hear some things that I've already said. However, I feel the need to repeat them because I'm trying to walk in your shoes, and here you are trying not only to pull a needs assessment together with the proper pieces fitting as they should be, in terms of understanding the organizational needs versus the individual needs, learning styles, content and skills and dispositions, and making it align with the needs of the organization. There's a lot of moving parts there to consider, and an engine of those moving parts, if that's an appropriate metaphor, is to consider program design itself. Now, I'm going to put on my idealist hat for a minute. Ordinarily, I'm not all that idealistic on many things, but when it comes to these kinds of things, I am. And how I personally view this may not be the way you internalize this insofar as your role as prospective human resource managers. But one way or another, I mean to use some of my language to help you recognize my own passion for it, and hope that you embed some of it in your own HR souls, so to speak, to see the importance of this. It's pretty easy on one level, if you think about it, to put together workshops and presentations and jamborees and Broadway shows if you need to do that. It's another thing to recognize what you need to do to chase the folks down. And that's the metaphor I'm using for the moment, which is the thrill of the chase. That is to say, the thrill is going after something and truly trying to have it happen. To have the satisfaction of knowing that you've put all the parts in place, considered all the variables, took your shots where you needed to take them, hidden the bushes if you had to do that in order to capture your prey, Prey, prey. I guess those metaphors sound kind of violent as I'm saying it out loud, but that's how I kind of see it. Every workshop I've ever run, consult I've ever did, article I've ever written, book I've ever written, has been circled around this premise of trying to convince folks that what I have to offer them is in their best interest and has importance. And so I call it the thrill of the chase. Now, on the one hand, I'm also contradicting myself by talking at you. Were we in the same class physically together, or even synchronously online, we'd have lots of chances to try some other things out. And so really what I'm doing is kind of negating what I talk about, not practicing what I preach, I guess is a better way to put it. And I have to admit to that. And I think you, on the other hand, I think you as adults probably appreciate the fact that I'm trying to make the time spent worth your time as well. So without any more gobbledygook and without any more conversation, in my mind, it's about the thrill of the chase. I hope that you can sort of see that yourself. And if you don't, maybe when we get to the end of this, we'll do that. Now, as I said, I am going to repeat myself. I am going to repeat myself, which is something my children and my wife are sick of hearing as well. So I'm going to repeat myself, and here we go. This is repetitious. And that goes back, and you heard it before, but here I am saying it again. When we're talking about the overview of this course, notice the verbs. Generate factors for preparing the site. Practice and master curriculum mapping. Applying learners' characteristics. Creating reference, I can't forget what RFP stands for, request for proposals, breaking down program design elements, developing self-management modes, devising the whole system, distributing the skills. None of those are lots. None of those are lower order thinking skills, tasks. All of them are higher order skills. Nonetheless, I repeat the Bloom's taxonomy triangle for you again. And I don't necessarily always agree with this. That's a subject for another conversation, another time. Is the lower order skills, starting from the bottom up, as the basis, as in remembering, as in understanding, as in applying, are considered to be the low order skills, without which you won't be able to employ the higher order skills, the HOTS, as in the ability to analyze, the ability to evaluate, the ability to create. And as the triangle narrows, the implication is that analyzing, evaluating, and creating are the hard ones. And yes, they are. I can make an argument for tipping this triangle when it's in, with starting with creating on the bottom in a small point and working back outwards. Because sometimes I think we say, well, you need to know how to add before you multiply, and multiply before you divide, and know your ABCs before you can read, these kinds of things. And yeah, there's some controversy about some of those points. Notwithstanding, the verbs that we're using here are all higher order skills. I'm not going to repeat them to you again. These are the goals of this particular chapter, and these are very ambitious goals to be considered in one chapter, which means I'll probably spread this to another week rather than try to beat you over the head with this. I also felt the need, coming back to him. By the way, many of you made great points about Malcolm Knowles in your discussion questions. And I continue to praise you as a whole with a W, and individually for the quality of the questions that you have, and your ability to respond to other people's points of view. Not every one of you is doing it, and that's an obligation of the study, or rather of the course. And so, for those of you who have not been doing that, I suggest that you may want to start doing that right quick. Anyway, I want to also remind you, going back to Knowles and the adult learning theory. I don't know if this captures all of Knowles' theory. In fact, it doesn't collect all of Knowles' theory, but working from this of adult learning, what it does is it does give you an acorn to work with from which mighty oak trees can grow. And so Confucius, great Chinese philosopher, supposedly said, what's there? I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. Take that to heart. In the end, you need to create a program design where the participants are going to remember and be able to apply to whatever their individual and group task might be as such. So this particular slide gives you an overview of the entire chapter's expectations and tasks. And Bloom's taxonomy, you'll probably see again before I'm finished, shows you how all of these verbs are higher order skills, which I suppose are based on remembering, understanding, and applying. And then we crown that off with Malcolm Knowles' learning theory and trying to pinpoint that much more by working with our friend Confucius. Now it's about designing the site. What is the site going to look like? S-I-T-E, site. What is it going to look like? If you build it correctly, they will come and they will flourish in it. They will nurture it. The metaphor I'm using here, and I use this metaphor a lot in lots of places, is a lily pond. Could be one in your backyard. I've tried to do that once or twice, not with a whole lot of success. Could be an aquarium for that matter, which I've also haven't done very well in my days, or a pond that you may enjoy sitting by in a park or some sort of place where nature actually has its way with us. A pond is it's a complicated site. For those lily pads to flourish, that water's got to be right. The temperature's got to be right. The amount of sunlight's got to be right. The organisms underneath that water and often above that water all have to be part of the whole with a W. So you come back to Senge for a minute and the systems thinking. All the systems have to be aligned. When one of the systems goes out of whack, that everything else goes with it. I live in Sayville, in Long Island. I'm not sure if many of you, I think, are from the city. The Great South Bay is maybe 2 miles from my house. One time, the Great South Bay was the world's center for oysters and for clams, but certainly for oysters. Blue Point oyster, if you ever heard of that. They're trying to regenerate that Great South Bay, but the short story is the clams died off. The oysters were fished out, and the clams were fished out too. But not only that, the water became unsuitable for most living organisms. One of the reasons for that being, without getting into the gory details, is we don't have sewers out here in Suffolk County, except in the western part, one part of the western part of Suffolk County. And so the basic way we get rid of waste is through cesspools. And cesspools leach what cesspools hold eventually into the groundwater. And when it gets into the groundwater, eventually finds its way into the ocean or into rivers, which flow into the ocean. And so most of the Great South Bay is really barely suitable for any kind of living organism, I think. Maybe I'm probably overstating that. But all of which speaks about how one piece of the system changes and it mushrooms out, ripples out, to come back to the metaphor of the pond as we go with that. That accents the point that when you create the site or sites or pieces of the site, you really need to think about how you're going to make that happen. I think a mistake that my experiences are that people look for some kind of fancy ballroom and a fancy place with lots of good food, which doesn't mean those things are bad necessarily, but without thinking about what they mean to do with that space. What is that? What's going to happen in that corner of the room? Or is everyone going to sit in rows? Are they going to sit in a circle? Are they going to sit in small groups? Are you going to break out into different parts, other rooms, in order to do group tasks? Are you going to have them communicate across those rooms, which is a very interesting way to approach professional development, by the way. And so considering the site itself has great importance. Are you going to go off-site or are you going to go on-site? The advantage of it being on-site is that people know where it is. They can get to it relatively without any issues. And they do that. If you take them off-site, again, you may have the fancy ballroom to take advantage of, and even little hotel rooms to work from. But that creates other logistic issues that you must take account for in order to make everything come together. Again, with the idea that this has to be pre-configured against the design of what you intend to see have happen, against the training goals. Sometimes training goals are served, by the way. Bernardo is working with you now. That is to say, talking at you. And so you can put people in a room and to talk at them and run a PowerPoint, as I'm doing, and you might be able to claim that the people have heard and rather have done and understood. Although I know it's pretty hard to do something when you're sitting in rows in a big room like that, if you think about it. And so, really, if you think about circles, what will be the physical arrangement of the participants? Circles creates a different kind of dynamic than rows does. Think about when you went to school. When you sat in rows, the message was the teacher stood in the front, and she dictated and ran all the learning, and you were supposed to sit in rows and basically listen and write down, which may be the way you prefer to learn, but it may not be the way that learning preference may not be what you need to see have happen for an effectively meeting the goals that you've set for this. So I would argue against using that unless you absolutely had to. Circles, on the other hand, creates a different dynamic. Rhetorical question. What's the message when I'm sitting in a circle? For me, the message is people are expected to look at each other instead of at the teacher. In schools, they call that the guide on the side versus the sage on the stage. If I'm sitting in rows, that's sage on the stage. That's Deepak Chopra talking at you. That's somebody even on TED Talks talking at you, and very effectively sometimes. If I'm in a circle, you're expected to interact. You're expected to engage with each other, bounce off each other's points of view, and pay attention to, if that's what your goal strategy is. All right? Breakout rooms is more obvious because breakout rooms send a message. And by the way, they could be in rows, they could be in circles, they could be in small groups as well. But the breakout rooms account for smaller group approaches because you divided the task in certain senses so that the people in the individual groups eventually have to come back together to synthesize what they're thinking about, to solve the problem in terms of how Knowles would advocate. There's a lot to be said here about this. I'm not demeaning this at all because I think that this has great import. I'll give you a silly example. A friend of mine was a teacher, taught 7th grade social studies, and he needed to teach the geography of New York State. He put all the students in a circle. Then he took masking tape, and from the front of the room, going out to the back of the room, he taped the outline of New York State, which is basically a triangle with a fish on the side, which pretty much represents Long Island. And he had the kids all in a circle. And the kids could practically be blindfolded and find their way to Albany, Rochester, to the Adirondack Mountains, and to the Erie Canal, and all these good things. What he didn't take into account for was where the kids were sitting. So the kids were sitting all around the circle, and so they were getting a different view of New York State than he wanted. So basically, what he was looking at as the bottom of the triangle being New York City, spreading out up into Canada. And so he thought he was pretty clever, and he was, and he was on the whole pretty effective, but he dropped the ball because he failed to recognize that the perspective of the group was different from different places. Something else to think about. Okay, so I could talk for many hours about what these all mean and suggest. But for the point now, I just want to take some sandpaper and scrape your brains to consider how the physical arrangement of the rooms or room or site sends a message to the learners, to the participants, about what the expectation that they need to invest to master the goals that you have for them. Wish I could say that again because I like the way I said it. You can play it again whenever YouTube it. All right, so Obviously, what equipment do you use? Nothing is more frustrating for the sages on the stage, as well as the facilitators, the people who teach, who work with participants, from a more facilitative, guide on the side approach, than not have the equipment work right. Hello, do you need a technology person there with you, persons? Someone to make assure that the technology works. You know the answer to that. What materials are you going to have created? Are you going to create hard copies of everything and have every participant get a loose leaf folder of all the materials? There's advantages to that because it's a hard copy. The disadvantage is that people begin to thumb through it and sometimes get lost in the trees for the forest. On the other hand, it is something they can have. Are you going to give them a thumb drive? Not even sure thumb drives are being used anymore. Or you're going to have it recorded to the clouds and give them the website for them to be able to access from their own technology or some combinations of that. How are you going to do it? Who is going to do it? And obviously you're going to work with the program design consultant to pull that together. Most importantly, I've already said this, are the goals valid? That is, are the goals valid and are the strategies reliable? Goals have to do with, again, goals. I'm using goals and objectives interchangeably here for a moment. Are the goals clear and they aligned with what everyone who makes those decisions wants? Are the strategies aligned with the goals? Are the strategies appropriate for the goals? My friend, the 7th grade social studies teacher, pretended to burn kids at the stake when he taught the Iroquois Indians. It was very graphic. He didn't light anybody up, but a very graphic thing to look at, kids to consider. Really wasn't all that important to recognizing the skill sets as such, but it certainly caught students' attention. There's a saying for first grade teachers: never bring in an elephant into a first grade classroom to teach the color gray. Oh, the students are going to know that an elephant is gray, but are they going to remember it from having seen the gray elephant, or are they all caught up in watching watching Dumbo move around the room? So you go back, you recognize what the strategies, plural, that the sages on the stage or the guides on the side are going to use, and whether they are aligned with, are appropriate for what you need to have happen, and based on sound learning theory, quite frankly. And again, in design, it's like, who are the trainers? The trainers may be inside people, and I always recommend that for many parts. But there are times when you need to bring a prophet from another land in, or prophets. But my recommendation always is that you tie the prophets back to the inside people. The inside people almost always have more validity than the prophet, believe it or not. And the fact that you are recognizing the inside people as having worth and have great value to whatever it is you're trying to train your staff to do, it validates them and strengthens the whole approach. However, sometimes you need to bring in a consult or two to bring the points across. So that goes back to the premise of internal experts, as I mentioned a minute ago, and what credentials everyone brings. And sometimes people say, hey, I'm picking on Deepak Chopra today. I don't know why. I have great admiration for him. I got Deepak Chopra here today, coming in next week. Wow, that's great. But I need somebody to show how we're going to reassemble an automobile. That's a terrible example. It's the first thing I could think of. What does Deepak Chopra know about that? He may be a very attractive speaker. He may have people dancing in the aisles or crying into their handkerchiefs. But if the credentials don't match what your goals are, then clearly it's silly to bring in some kind of star from someplace, unless your purpose is merely to entertain people. Often keynotes are like that. And quite frankly, I don't recommend that. the keynote that makes people laugh and or cry and turn to someone else and tell them their life story without any connection to or link with what you're trying to have happen. Maybe just me being a fuddy-duddy. I don't think you haven't got the time to necessarily indulge yourself on that. Does the trainer, whether they're internal trainers, whether they're internal or external or both, do they know how to teach? Learning is not talking. Remember, I just said that, right? Let's go back to Confucius. Learning is about creating experiences. Well, clearly talking or communication has a point to that. That engages people to want to learn more or to internalize what it is you want to be able to have them master. Which goes to the last piece. Again, I speak to the premise of engagement. I do, and I understand, which again reflects Malcolm Knowles, and he talks to what's the philosophy of delivery. Is it aligned with the learning needs? Which brings me back, I'm just going to hold my wrist up, where you need to take the measure of the folks who you're working with. Depending on what their capacity is, and depending on what their learning task is, has to dictate the kind of delivery that teaching philosophies, plural, you may want to use. If you come in with some high-blown simulation, and that's something we're going to talk about extensively in a couple of weeks, but something I happen to espouse more often than not, but not always. Or if you're talking about people doing role plays or sending messages to each other across great distances, those are all good for certain kinds of learners, and might be problematic for other kinds of learners. On the other hand, if you put me in a room and said, I want you to figure out which lug nut goes on which part of the wheel, the car would never have wheels. And so you have to take the measure of that, and you have to be, you might need help figuring that piece out. Now, there's something called curriculum mapping. I'm way older than all of you, so I don't expect any of you to remember the TV series, although it was on several different kinds of incarnations over the last 50 years, called Dragnet. Dragnet was the original Crime Story series. There's pretty sophisticated ones on TV right now, but Dragnet was usually about two detectives who investigated a crime. And one of them, Jack Webb, was the chief detective. When he was interviewing a witness, and the witness started to wander off and talk about how terrible what she saw was and so forth, he would say his famous phrase was, "Just the facts, man." Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, kinds of things. Just the facts. That is not curriculum, he shouted. That's content within the curriculum. If all you need to have happens for people to memorize who sailed the ocean blue in 1492 or something like that, you could construe that as curriculum. But what you're not construing is how you deliver that, unless you think about it that much more. Which goes back to the premise of course goals versus course objectives. We talked about this already. There's a little Venn diagram where I show you that goals are the wider piece, the wider target. The objectives are more narrow. The objectives is the bullseye within the target. The archer will hit the bullseye 10 out of 15 times, 10 out of 15 tries. If he hits it 9 times out of 15, he's failed the objective. He may have met the goal of hitting the targets, but not that. So that's a specific that one needs to consider when you write these things out. And again, I go back to this premise, and I'll repeat it a few more times today, is the content versus the skills. Content is facts. Skills are bundles of habits and abilities that may need the content, but also speak to motor dexterity, social skills, social interactions premise. Skills are deeper as such. And I'll give you better examples of that in a minute. And here it is. This is a silly example. I would invite you to take a crack at this before you sit down and try to create that program design. And here it is. So if we Columbus were the subject, so to speak, there's content, there's skills, and the processes. And the examples of content is Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. You've targeted, when we use the word convergent skills convergent a few times, it's convergent, specifics. Always necessary to some extent or another. Whether you choose to emphasize that or whether you choose to elevate that is the next question. So the next piece might be skills. I've elevated the premise about Columbus now. I say, okay, using a map, trace Columbus's route. Tracing Columbus's route. I apologize for that. My wife's not home and can't answer the phone. Tracing Columbus's route is a body of geography skills, and they are behaviors that need to be practiced and mastered. That's different than just targeting on converging on facts. And then there's processes. Processes are those higher order thinking skills. Processes are strategies by which you learn, how you figure things out, how you problem solve. So we're studying Columbus. You might say, well, who discovered America? Someone might say, well, Columbus discovered America. And I can see 10 people standing up and saying, no, he didn't. And you can run through any number of choices on that count. So these are thinking strategies that are necessary for deep problem solving, if that's what you want your participants to be able to master. So the rhetorical question is, where do you land on this? Do you want to assure yourself that you're running content skills processes? Or do you need to focus on one of these more specifically? Big decision to make here. The pivot point for sure. Again, content is facts, it's data, it's information, it's specifics. It's a body of knowledge. The skills are process-based often. They're bundled competencies, and you need to master and develop them. We've already talked about goals and objectives. Goals are broad statements. Want something that you really want to see happen. They have to be aligned with the organization's, he shouted, long-term strategies. Objectives are a subset of that. Objectives are SMART, which is an acronym for they're specific, you can measure them, they're also achievable. They're not some kind of crazy thing. Find aliens in the next 3 years, kind of. That's not a very good objective because it's not realistic, and they're targeted. That acronym you should apply when you write your goals out. How can I convert these goals to objectives? Can I convert these goals to objectives? Again, assuming that they're aligned to the needs and wants of your participants and of the organization. And then if you need to satisfy people, and I'm not denigrating this, I think it's an important point, then you need to write objectives. And objectives are harder to write than goals. I can show you how to do that down the line. Now, curriculum mapping is this is how you practice it. First of all, you begin with a deep purpose. To make money is not a deep purpose. The deep purpose is, in this case, is to, in your case, to create, to enable your participants to meet the mission of your company, or to meet their own personal mission, for that matter, which is even better if you can somehow cross-match them. So they are enmeshed with shared vision. If you can't trace it back to the shared vision, you're missing something. You're not aligned, go back and find it. They're timetabled. I get a little nervous about that one sometimes, but many organizations will say, well, when are we going to get this done by? I don't want to lollygaggle on this. And someone will say, well, by October. Well, sometimes that's dangerous, and we'll come back to that another day. Do they have the necessary skills and strengths? We talked about that already. Who are the people whom you're working with? Do they have the skills and the strengths to work with you on this? Well, that's a bad way to frame it. What kinds of skills and abilities that do they need in order to meet the goals? And are they aligned? You're going to write goals first, and then you're going to write objectives that reflect the goals in that order. You can't write an objective before you write a goal. What are the expectations of the strategies and activities that you're going to use to have that happen? Are you going to draw a map on the floor and have people sit around it and then try to figure out what the map means? Or are you going to have give them Legos and say, make a statue out of the Legos? What kind of activities are you going to use? Remember, the more experiential you try to do, the better the more effective you're going to be in most cases. With this proviso, when you go experiential, you go slow. If you go fast, you talk like Bernardo was talking to you now, and understand the difference. Because if you go too fast for too many things, you will have paid people to do things for nothing. On the other hand, if you take all day to teach people how to paint the elephant, then it's going to take a long time. What are the skills of the workshop leaders or leader? Are they personable? Do they know how to organize material? Are they willing to experiment and take risk with you as such? And if you looked at the Scott Rock's consulting case study I gave you, what are the time estimations? And are they realistic? He shouted. This is not a muscle for Dr. B. Dr. B is really bad at estimating the numbers of reasons. One of them is, so I always think something might take an hour, and it winds up taking 3, and then everything sort of jumbles behind that. That isn't good. You're going to have to come up with some flexible time estimations in order to assure yourself that you're going to be complete. Again, what are the materials and technologies that you need? Most importantly, how will you evaluate these strategies? We're going to spend a lot of time on this in a week or two. I don't like the verb I'm going to use because it's low level, but it's the first one I can think of. Let me change that. How will you decide? That's a higher level verb. How will you decide that your strategies were effective? That's a goal, not an objective. That's a good goal. How will you know that they can put the hubcap back on the wheel? That they can complete the forms when they're dealing with clients? How will you know? What is the outcome? What is the output? Now, what I decided to mention here, this is just going to mention this man. His name is Grant Wiggins. And he came up with a way to a design that I espouse myself, and that is backwards by design. Now, backwards by design, first you think about the end product, then you work backwards. So if I know, and this is not a great example, I'm trying to think of I know I have some people who work in health. And I apologize for those of you who work in health if I misrepresent what you actually do. I apologize for that in advance. So if you had a backward design, you might say, I want all of my customer representatives to be able to pinpoint clients' needs through 3 or 4 questions. I'm not sure how good an output that is, but I'll use it for the moment. If that's your end product, being able to diagnose and pinpoint a client's needs through a series of questions. What do you need to do before that to train your customer rep? What do you need to do before that? What it forces you to do is when you work backwards, is to be very careful. First of all, know what your end product is, which is always a good thing. And also recognize all the steps that go before that. Try it out. It's a intriguing way to approach things. And again, we talked about learners' characteristics. What's your audience? What are the capacities for what you're trying to target? Do they have dispositions, which is to say, do they have attitudes pro or con, one way or another? Learning styles is an interesting premise because a lot of learning theorists are now shooting us down. But we have spoken about this a little bit, where we said that learning styles is about right brain, left brain. Right brain activities are supposedly for people who are more creative than the left brain people, and left brain people are more logical. And I'm being very, very generalizable about that. Again, I'm going to date myself, and I'm not sure how many of you will understand that example, but I'll try. Mr. Spock was left brain. Dr. McCoy was right brain, or Captain Kirk, whichever one you want to. Spock was all about logic. That's about left brain. Right brain's about writing poetry and feeling and creating. But there are other learning styles to think about, and that would be whether they're tactile, whether they're good about moving around and doing things from a physical point of view, or if they're visual learners. Again, many of us often tend to think that most learners are visual and auditory. Not always true. You have to pay attention to that. And you also have to pay attention to those people who learn best by reading other people's emotions. Which brings us to what I would call a lesson plan. It kind of looks like this: in line, goal, objectives, materials, strategies per objective, what activities, what questions, what tasks are you going to design, formative versus summative evaluation. Along the way, you ask questions. If they can't tell you what 2 + 2 is after you've taught it, in the middle of the class lesson, then or the activity, you know that you're missing something. You drop back and punt, and you try to start again by saying, okay, what did I miss by realizing now in the middle of the class that the workshop that they're not able to meet the task, and change it there rather than wait to the end of the activity and say, oh, well, they didn't meet the task. Now what do I do? So there's a difference between formative strategies and summative. Ordinarily, you could say questions is a great formative strategy, but there's other ways to do that. Again, depending on what the task might be. I flunked shop because I could not square a piece of wood. He smiled. I lost the medal I was supposed to get a medal. They wouldn't give it to me because I flunked shop. Because Mr. Van Bargen, may he rest in peace, never knew I wasn't I wasn't squaring the stupid board right angles. I didn't have any idea what he meant by that. And he wouldn't show me how to fix it. So I said, okay, and I flunked. There's an example of an instructor who didn't take the time to formatively evaluate. Critical, and we'll talk more about this in subsequent chapters. I'll just mention it now. Critical is post-training application. You spent a lot of money and used a lot of time up to invest in your staff to train them to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now they leave, they say, thank you very much. And now they go out back into their workplace. And now you're hoping that they're going to apply these premises along the way. So it's critical to really know what you're looking for in terms of metrics and in terms of soft skill evaluation. And I'm going to spend more time on this. I think I glossed over this a little bit too early in the course about what we call qualitative methods, not quantitative. I'm talking about qualitative methods, the soft skills evaluation, to assure that themes that you see, that people seem to be embracing, and how they're going about it, namely the patterns, seem to be going on, and whether there's discrepancies between what you wanted and what's happening. Need to build this in? In fact, that may be what you want to start with if you're working backwards, as I suggest that you try, even though it's a lot harder to do than the other way around. So think about it from reading right to left instead of reading left to right. Okay, there's a lot of material here, and I talk quickly, but and I'm going to revisit a lot of these things. I'm not sure what discussion questions I'm going to employ on this, but I urge you to think hard and long about this, because much of what this is about is going to empower you to truly meet the premises in the Scott Rocks consulting firm case study. And I'll give you a hint. I think in that timetable and that plan, take a hard look at that plan. Enough said. So what I'm going to do is stop the share. I'm going to put on Aaron Judge, and then I will I'll probably drop in with a couple of some other material or post some other material before the weekend comes, or we get to the end of the weekend. But this is plenty for now. Take care.